All right. Hope you're well this weekend. Those of you worshiping with us at our other campuses, I'm just so pleased that we are together today to launch this brand new series, and it's just called Missing the Point. And it's about when religion gets in the way of God. I think it's going to be a fascinating series of conversations together. Series is 6 weeks in length, takes us right up to Easter weekend, first part of April, and I get to cover 4 parts of the series, and Pastor Aaron Buer will jump in and take the other 2. So 6-part series launches today. I hate to dive into the deep end by quoting a hefty theologian and a deep theological quote, but let's begin there with Ricky Gervais. All right. British comedian Ricky Gervais, who said, good people do good things, bad people do bad things, and when you find good people doing really bad things, religion is usually involved. He's wrong, isn't he? Good people do good things, bad people do bad things, and when you find good people doing really bad things, often religion is involved. Been reading a book. It's been written by a guy, pastor by the name of Tim Harlow. He pastors in the Chicago area. And early in the book, he tells a story about a friend of his by the name of Caleb. He says, my friend Caleb's parents split up when he was very young. So he grew up living with his mom and her lesbian partner. When he got older, he became a Jesus follower. We have talked at great lengths about how the actions, bitterness, and even hatred of some Christians have driven people farther away from Jesus. And then here's his friend Caleb writing this. He says, he's talking about like when he was like 9 years old. Some Christians are still shocked when I tell them that I marched in gay pride parades with my mom and her partner Vera. He says it never fails that usually someone will immediately ask if I saw anything inappropriate in the parades. And Caleb says the most inappropriate thing I saw was at the end of the parade. Remember, there's reflections of a 9-year-old. There were supposed Christians holding up signs that said things like, God hates fags. If that weren't offensive enough, when people from the parade walked over to dialogue with them, they were sprayed with water and with urine. I asked my mom and Vera why Christians would act this way. My mom looked at me and said something to the effect of, Caleb, they're Christians, and Christians hate gay people. If you're not like them, they will not like you. So when asked if I saw anything inappropriate during the parades, I'd say absolutely. The reactions of the Christians at the end of the parade was so inappropriate that it made me despise all Christians and assume that Jesus must be horrible if his followers were so awful. So let's talk. Let's talk about when religion gets in the way of God. And just a confession right out of the gate, could we just confess the possibility that perhaps believers have not always done the greatest job in interacting with people who hold different views or different lifestyle practices? Can we confess the possibility that believers have not always been at their best in how to view life from a radically different perspective? Now, this is not a uniquely American challenge, and this is not a challenge this generation or the last couple generations. Jesus pinpointed some of this when addressing a group called the Pharisees in the first century. The Pharisees, I believe, were well-meaning, intense religious rule keepers. I want you to see something in Matthew 23 that he said to the Pharisees. He said, you shut the door of the kingdom of God in people's faces. There are people who are trying to find their way to God, and it's like you slam the door in their faces. He says that in Matthew chapter 23. I wonder how that's going to go down. I wonder how people are going to respond to that. Well, here's a calendar of the week. Jesus says that on a Tuesday. He's going to get killed on a Friday. In fact, while controversy and conflict has been brewing for the 3 years of Jesus' ministry, his last week in Jerusalem largely centered in the temple area. It reaches a boiling point. What I want to suggest is that it's what Jesus does on Monday, and it's what he says on Tuesday. It's going to get him crucified on Friday. As we spent in this series, today we're going to look at something he did on Monday. And then the next 5 messages are all teachings, controversies, arguments that take place on Tuesday. The easiest thing for us to do is to look back at the Pharisees and the religious leaders and the chief priests of the first century and going, those guys were a bunch of idiots. I think the healthiest stance we can take as we look at this material is not simply look at the mistakes that they made, but also the opportunity to kind of hold up a mirror to us and just kind of, here's what I'm asking. Please come to each conversation with a soft heart. A soft heart and open hands just to say, okay, we see what they did. What is it that I do? What is it that we do? And to come with a soft heart and open hands is just a way of saying, okay, gracious God, please speak to me, amend my life. I give you permission to alter my reactions, my attitudes, my behaviors. But right out of the gate, just understand something. When you are heavily involved and invested in a religious system and someone approaches you and tells you you're missing the point, a lot of times a reaction can be violent. And that's what will happen with Christ. Now, today's story, the introductory story in this series, it unfolds in 3 parts. And the first part is just called a tour of the temple. Because this last week of Jesus' life focuses in a specific location at a specific edifice, and it's the temple of Jerusalem. And I don't want to assume that everybody's familiar with the temple and what happened there and what the temple was about. And so because we're going to be spending weeks at this place, right out of the gate, let me just take you on a tour of the temple in Jerusalem. And so if you're there today, and there's this ridge to the eastern side. We call it a mount, the Mountain of Olives, but it's really a long hill, but it's a ridge. And if you're on the Mount of Olives looking across the valley, you can see the outline of old walls, and then you see this structure here, which is the Dome of the Rock. And the Dome of the Rock is an Islamic mosque, but it is believed that the Dome of the Rock is about where the Temple of Jerusalem once stood. And so that's what you would see if you're on the Mount of Olives looking to the Temple of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount today. Now, back in the day, this is kind of an artist's rendition of what we believe the Temple Mount looked like, the Temple Plaza, based upon the archaeological ruins. And it was massive. It was huge. In fact, Herod the Great, by the way, he was not called the Great because of his character. He called Herod the Great because of his architecture, and he built so many buildings in his day. But the biggest structure that he built, the most elaborate construction project, was expanding the temple area. Now, the temple was on a hill, and so if you want to expand the courtyards or the plaza, you've got to have these massive retaining walls, and there's tons and tons of dirt that fill in that space. And Herod's temple complex, as he expanded it, was 35 acres. Now, that might not mean anything to you, but imagine being on a football field. Right? Some of you that have never been on a football field or played football, you've seen one, right? You get the idea of kind of like the shape, configuration of a football field. Imagine starting in one end zone and then just strolling to the opposite end zone. So you get kind of a football field in your mind. A football field is 1.3 acres. The temple compound is the size of 25 football fields. I've been up there a couple times, walked from side to side. It is a bunch of real estate. But much of Herod's work was putting up these massive retaining walls. You've seen this picture right here, or a picture of this site. It's called the Western Wall. It used to be called the Wailing Wall. Observant, practicing Jews will often approach the wall, and they will pray there at this wall, often writing down prayers and sticking the prayers in the cracks between the stones. And many of you have shown this picture of the Western Wall. So where is that? You'd say, it's in Jerusalem. But let me show you where it is specifically. There is the Dome of the Rock. The Western Wall is right there. For an observant Jew, that's as close as you can get to where the Temple of Jerusalem once stood. And the place that is the holiest site in the world for observant Jews is because they believe that the presence of God never left that space. And to approach that wall is to get as close as they possibly can physically to where the Temple of Jerusalem once stood up above on the other side. Now, here's a layout of the temple in the first century. Now, I need you to pay attention because there's going to be a quiz. There's going to be a quiz at the end of this little part. So we've kind of drawn this in red just so it pops a little bit. There's different gaps in it. This courtyard out here is called the Court of the Gentiles. All right, can you say it with me? The Court of, ready? The Gentiles. Now, if you were non-Jewish ethnically, you could go up to that wall and no farther. So if you were not Jewish, you could go to the Court of the Gentiles and at least face the temple that was in Jerusalem, Court of the Gentiles. This courtyard right here is called the Court of the Women. I didn't make the rules, I'm just reporting them. And so you could go into this courtyard here. If you were Jewish ethnically and you were female, you could go into the Court of the Women. And so on the other side, you said, well, dudes, apparently they go all the way in. No, there was a little tiny courtyard on the other side that Jewish men could go into, and that's called the Court of Israel. So when I point to this area, you say this is the Court of the Women, and then just on the other side, that's the Court of Israel. Now, a little bit different picture to give you some, there we go. Court of the Women here, entryway, Court of Israel right there. But on the other side of that, that's where the priests could go. And there was a burning altar there, altar with fire, and literally people would bring animal sacrifices. It's first century, time of Jesus. The idea was that if you had ripped somebody off, slandered somebody, lied about somebody, you had an obligation to make that right, to make amends with that person. But in addition to that, you also had to make amends with God. And so you would bring a lamb, or for poorer people, like a couple doves or a couple pigeons, and you would come to the temple area, and then the priests, they would sacrifice this in order to kind of clean things up between you and God. And so that's where the priests were. But then you say, that building must have been nice to go in there. You couldn't go in there. Well, a priest could go into that space inside there. This next picture, that is called the holy place. Can you say that with me? The holy place. Okay, now, holy place is like a priest could go in there, like certain priests, designated ones, like at 9 o'clock in the morning, like 3 o'clock in the afternoon during prayer times. And one of the objects that was in there was an incense altar, had like coals on it, and you would put incense on it. Again, the prayer time's like 9 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon. And as the smoke went up in the air from the incense, people would gather outside to be praying. But as the priest went inside, did the incense thing, it's like your prayers were being carried up in the air to God. But priests just couldn't wander in there randomly. You had to be in there for a reason, just designated priests for designated responsibilities. There's a big curtain right here. It's tall, it's thick. And on the other side of the curtain, there was an interior room. Only one priest, the high priest, could go. I believe it was like one day a year. It was the Day of Atonement. Does anyone know what the name of the room is on the other side of the curtain? The other side of the curtain was called the Holy of Holies, the holiest place of holiest places. And at one time, this object was in there, the Ark of the Covenant, representing God's agreement with his people, God's covenant, the covenant he had made with his people. And this is in the holiest of holy spaces, that room that represented the presence of the Creator on planet Earth. The Ark of the Covenant disappeared long ago, was later found by American archaeologists, put in a crate and held in a large warehouse. You can watch Raiders of the Lost Ark for more information on that. Ark has been lost, but so go with me back to the outside. So here's your quiz. You ready? You ready? Out here, the court of the women. Right here, the court of Israel. And this first room, the holy place, and then the back room, the holy of holies. Okay, this is the temple complex in Jesus' day. Saying, dude, wait a minute, sacrifices are offered there? Yes. Let me get this right. If I'm a Jew and I live down in Egypt, and I harm somebody, steal something, and I got to make amends with them, and then I got to go make amends with God, I got to haul a lamb all the way from Egypt up to the temple in Jerusalem? If I'm in northern Galilee and I'm a peasant class and I wound someone, I got to carry a couple doves in a cave day after day, or in a cage, or a cave if you like, all the way down to Jerusalem. No. Fortunately, for your convenience, you could just bring some money with you and buy the critters once you got there. Awesome, right? We'll see. Part number 1, the tour of the temple. Part number 2 of our story, disruption of the temple. Disruption of the temple. Mark chapter 11. On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. And there's 3 things I want you to notice here. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those, category number 2, selling doves, and would not allow anyone to, third, carry merch through the temple courts. The disruption of the temple. And the first one was turned over the tables of the money changers. What's up with that? Okay, walk into a coffee shop. It's in the morning. Just order simple brewed coffee. It's like $2.50. You got a $5 bill in your pocket. Barista's ringing up the sale. You pull out the $5 bill and you hand it to her. It's a Canadian $5. And she says, do you have any American currency? And you go, what's wrong with this? Nothing, but we want to keep the Canadians out. No, it's it's possible she might look at it and say, listen, there's a bank right across the street, down a couple. If they can change that for you, I can, but I can't take this. It's just a common currency exchange. Now, we're joking a little bit with Canadian currency, but it was much bigger of an issue if you wanted to come to the temple in Jerusalem and pay the annual temple tax that your family would pay as an observant Jewish person, because often if you came from another part of the country or even from Israel, your currency looked something like this. This is a picture of Tiberius Caesar. It's like his dad, Caesar Augustus, and then Tiberius comes after. And over here on the coin, there's a T-I, stands for Tiberius, and then Tiberius, Caesar. And you got this little thing here, D-I-V-I, Divi. What does that stand for? It stands for the divine. His godness. Now, as I understand this particular coin, it wasn't saying that Tiberius was God. It's saying that his dad was. It's like the other side of the coin. It's like Tiberius, the son of Caesar Augustus, the divine. Now, what I want to suggest to you is this, that if you're carrying these coins around with you, probably not best to come into the temple and put a coin into the offering basket that says Caesar is God. Into the temple in Jerusalem. And those that didn't have an inscription like this, even if they had the images of the emperors, and so what you do when you got to Jerusalem is you take your money, your coinage, and you get swapped over for the temple shekel, and then be able to pay the annual temple tax with the temple shekel. But it involves having currency exchange places. Now, those of you that have traveled around the world have seen currency exchange places. You're walking through Prague, and there are a number of them, 0% commission. No, 0% commission, just a small fee. or an exorbitant exchange rate. And you always wonder, walking into those places, am I getting ripped off here? Jesus comes in and he starts flipping over the tables of the currency exchange. See, I think there was a problem here. But I think something even deeper is going on. The first thing was that the tables of the money changers. What was the second thing? Tipped over the benches of those who were what? Who were selling doves. And just an image here of a cage with a couple doves. You're on the lower end of the economic scale. You don't want to haul these from home. You buy them there. And you could purchase lambs as well. And so what happened here was the temple was now part worship center, part 4-H fair. And so you've got the money, the currency exchange thing going on, and then you also got the animal sales going on. Now listen, Jesus is there during festival time. It's a time called a Passover. It is packed with pilgrims. We're talking thousands and thousands of animals and thousands of people trying to purchase animals for sacrificial reasons. Let's go back to the picture also. There's a third category. It's like those flipped over the tables of those money changers and then flipped over the benches of those selling doves. Does anyone remember what that first thing was? He wouldn't allow people to, what was it? Carry merchandise through the temple. Here's the deal. Out here is the Mount of Olives. Out here is the city of Jerusalem. Tons of pilgrims coming to your city, many of them coming up from the east, from Jericho. I'm telling you, man, you got a little refreshment kiosk, awesome place to set that up, tent sales, olive oil sales, anything like that. And this is a massive complex, 35 acres. You don't want to walk around that thing. If you need to get to this side and you're on this side, why not just take a shortcut? And so I think you have a parade of people coming through the temple, carrying stuff to sell and hawk on the other side. And it had turned the place into a zoo. I think we have a problem here. But I don't think the problem is simply what people were doing. I think the problem was where they were doing it. Would you like to guess where the currency exchange was and where the animal sales were? I'll give you a clue. It wasn't in the court of Israel, and it wasn't in the court of the women. Any guesses on what part of the temple the animal sales and the currency exchange and this merch being bussed through the entire time? Any guesses on where that was? The court of the Gentiles? If you're a non-Jewish person and you want to come and you want to get close to the God of Israel and you want to face the temple and you want to pray, you have to do it in this zoo of commerce and traffic. I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of quiet places to pray. Maybe you imagine this little chair in your family room next to a lamp and an end table. But I'm guessing that not many of you are thinking Best Buy. Just inside the front doors on the Friday immediately after Thanksgiving at about 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm thinking as a place to open your heart to God, you might find that less than ideal. I want you not only to see what Jesus did, I want you to listen to what he said. Because when he speaks, he is about to quote two prophets from the Jewish scriptures that had lived hundreds of years before. Jesus is going to quote the prophet Isaiah, and then later he's going to quote the prophet Jeremiah from what would be the Old Testament of your Bible. So listen to him here. Jesus says, "My house will be called a house of prayer for what? Help me here, for..." This is supposed to be a place of prayer for all nations. And Jesus, quoting Isaiah, written some, 600, 700 years before, where Isaiah the prophet is envisioning a day that will come in Israel from people far away from all these other countries will flock to Jerusalem and be able to open their hearts to the God of Israel. And the way Isaiah sees this vision, he says, my house will be a house of prayer for what? 2 words, for all nations. And Jesus goes, but you've turned it into a den of robbers. What I want you to feel here is the heartbeat of God for people who are on the outside looking in. The heartbeat of God for people who are on the outside looking in. The original temple had been built about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. I don't know, 1,000 BC or 900 BC, sometime out there. It had been constructed by a king, and the guy's name was King Solomon. His dad was King David, as in David and Goliath, King David. Now, David didn't build the temple, but he bought the property, and he set aside a mountain of coin so that later his son Solomon could build this temple. Solomon, King Solomon, son of King David, builds the temple. After the lengthy and elaborate construction process of the first temple, when it's open, Solomon offers this prayer to God about this temple. You find this in 1 Kings chapter 8, and I want you to see just a tiny bit of Solomon's prayer, and this is basically the opening ceremonies for the temple 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. Solomon prays this. He says, as for the foreigner who has come from a distant land because of your name, gracious God, do whatever the foreigner asks of you so that all the people on the earth may know your name. King Solomon is praying, when people come from the other nations, when they hear something about this God of Israel, and they come to the temple and they face the temple, gracious God, answer their prayers. Heal their body, heal their heart, heal their mother-in-law, whatever they're asking for, so that when they go back home, word will spread about you. What you have here is please hear the pulse of the heart of God for those that are on the outside looking in. I'm confident this morning that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of people who, if you really kind of drilled down on where they are in their faith journey, they would just willingly, if they honestly confess, dude, I'm not there yet. I'm just beginning to understand the Bible, this whole Jesus thing, who he was and what he did. I'm just putting the pieces together. But listen, I can taste something here. It's like there's this aroma. It's like walking down a street and the aroma of a bakery comes and you run in and you find yourself at the donut counter. I can smell something here. But they would say, but you right now, I honestly feel like I'm a starter, right? I'm a beginner. I'm kind of on the outside looking in. If that's where you find yourself, in the exploratory phase, information gathering phase, I just want you to sense the heartbeat of God for those who feel like they're on the outside looking in the actions of Jesus in disrupting the temple. And there are many more that I would say are not like exploring the faith, but you have been walloped by something. Some disappointment, some relationship. As you walk in today, there are knots in your stomach. It's hard to focus. People around you, they sing about the goodness and the faithfulness of God, and they look like they mean it. And you walk in and you sit down and you go, am I the only one here that's a mess? No. Am I the only one here falling apart? and you kind of feel like you're a little bit like on the outside looking in, I want you to feel the heartbeat of God for the person who feels distant, who feels far. And in any given weekend, with people who walk in any of our spaces who got involved with something and just feel shame, distance, kind of like, I'm here, but I don't belong here. I don't belong here. And if this were ever revealed, man, I feel like my life would be over. I want you to hear the heartbeat of God for those who feel like they're on the outside looking in, for those who feel far off. Jesus would tell a story, it's called a parable, about two men that go to the temple to pray. And he tells you who the people are. He says one person was a Pharisee, which had been, I think, a well-intentioned, rigorous, intense rule keeper. And he said, not only did the Pharisee go to the temple to pray, but the other guy, does anyone know how this parable went? The Pharisee and the tax collector went to the temple to pray. Now the Romans, they collected Roman taxes from the Jewish people, but the Romans would not collect your taxes. The Romans would hire Jewish people from your town or village to collect those taxes. These people did not make the list of your kid's birthday party invites. It's like they were seen as traitors, they were seen as compromisers, they were seen as collaborators with the enemy. A person became a tax collector when they said, I don't care if it burns all my bridges, I don't care if it messes up all my relationships, it's a great way to pull cash in, I don't care what it blows up. This is the tax collector. And Jesus said these two men go to the temple to pray. Please notice the setting of Jesus' story. Two men went to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And Jesus says, in the Pharisee, he prayed like this. He prays about himself. God, first of all, I just want to thank you. I thank you that I'm not like other people. Thank God I'm not like them. And he reels off some adulterers and thieves and like that tax collector. But then it's not just the bad stuff he doesn't do, it's the good stuff he does. And then the guy prays, I fast 2 days a week, sun up to sundown. I go without food 2 days a week, and I give 10% of all my stuff away. I give 10% of all I get. This is the prayer of the rule keeper. Thank God I'm not like them, and this is the stuff I do. And then Jesus flips the story and gives you the tax collector. But I want you to see, I want you to not only hear what he says, I want you to see where he is. But the tax collector stood where? The tax collector stood at a distance. My friends, I think tax collectors were out here in the court of the Gentiles. You want to collaborate with the Romans? Then you stand with the Romans. Tax collector stood at a distance. He's on the outside looking in. He won't even look up in the sky. He's got his head down. And as Jesus tells the story, he's kind of thumping on himself, and his prayer is short. It's like, God, have mercy on me. God, have mercy. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And by the way, if you find yourself in one of those spaces where your heart is confused, you don't even feel like you have the vocabulary to form a prayer, God have mercy, God have mercy. That's one you can remember. God have mercy. And Jesus ended the parable by saying this: it was the tax collector and not the Pharisee that went home clean, that went home right with God. What we have here is the heartbeat of God for the person who feels far, the person who feels like they're on the outside looking in. And so He flips over the tables of the money changers. He tips over the benches of people killing doves or selling doves. He prevents people who are carrying merchandise from using the court of the Gentiles as a shortcut. It looks like Jesus is doing everything he can to improve the temple. And he's not. When Jesus comes in and cleans house in the temple, he's not coming to improve the temple. He's coming to replace the temple. Third part of our conversation, replacing the temple. I want to go back to Mark 17. My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. That's taken from Isaiah chapter 56. But you have made it a den of robbers. That too is a recitation of the Old Testament scriptures. Happens to be Jeremiah chapter 7. Now, what's important about the fact that he's quoting from Jeremiah chapter 7 is the context of Jeremiah. Because the context of Jeremiah, 600 years before the time of Jesus, the Babylonian army from the north is traveling south. They will burn Jerusalem to the ground, and they will totally destroy the temple. And this quote from Jeremiah, "You have made it a den of thieves," is right before judgment is about to fall on Jerusalem. In other words, Jeremiah is saying, this place is going down and you're going down with it. And in quoting Jeremiah, Jesus' inference is, this place is going down and you're going down with it. The high priests and the system. You're saying, well, I hope the high priests weren't familiar with Jeremiah chapter 7 and what Jesus was inferring. They were very familiar with Jeremiah 7, and they knew exactly what Jesus was saying. Very next verse, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, when they heard this, began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. They know this is spoken against him, and yet Jesus has his fan club. They can't arrest him in public or a riot will break out. They got to find a way to get at him when nobody else is around. They need an insider. And they'll find one. His name is Judas. You see, back to the calendar of the week, I believe Jesus cleans house in the temple on Monday. He teaches these confrontational conversations on Tuesday. Wednesday is when a group called the Sanhedrin, the rulers of Israel, will meet to condemn him. Thursday is when Judas betrays him, and Friday is when he's on a cross. It's what he does on Monday, and it's what he says on Tuesday that will get him killed on Friday. The image of the crucifixion, Jesus suspended on a cross. It's like 9 o'clock on a Friday morning. And he breathes his last like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's like 6 hours on that Friday. 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock. From your quiz, you recognize this room, the holy place, where incense is offered to God 9 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's a curtain representing you can't pass this point. The presence of the creator of the universe is represented by the room on the other side of this. Listen, there's something that happens at the crucifixion, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when Jesus, it says, he cries out, he dies, and there's part of the crucifixion story that is often unseen or quickly forgotten, and it is this. At that moment, the curtain in the temple was torn from top to bottom. What's going on here? At that moment when Jesus dies, the temple curtain rips from top to bottom. Remember the way the temple is constructed. It's about access. It's about barriers. If you are a non-Jew, you can only go this far. If you're a woman, you can only go this far. If you're a Jewish dude, you can only go this far. If you're a priest, only this far. If you're only a priest with special responsibilities, this far. If you're only the high priest one day a year, you can get into that room that represents the presence of God. And it seems like Jesus is here handing out all access passes. See, his crucifixion doesn't improve the temple. His crucifixion replaces the temple. It's only a matter of time when people begin to travel and tell the story of the Christ who came, lived, taught, and died for us. Word spreads to a place called Ephesus. It's in modern-day Turkey on the coast, on the Aegean coast. Paul the Apostle will write this to brand new Christians around the area of Ephesus. Let me read this to you. He writes this. He says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were," 2 words, "far away, have been," what? 2 words, "brought near by the blood of Christ." Paul says, those of you, and many of his readers in Ephesus were from Greek idol worshiping background, all kinds of sketchy stuff in their background. And he says, you who were once far off have been brought near because of what Jesus did. You who were once far away, on the outside looking in, have been brought near by what Jesus did. So let's end with the image we started with. No, not Ricky Gervais, but the closed door. Do you remember a time when it felt like the door kind of got slammed in your face? Perhaps it was a parent or parents from a church-going family, but you could never win their approval. You could never earn their favor. Constant, you're not doing this right, you're not doing this right, you're not doing this right. And you think, man, I can't even get the favor of my parents. Why should I even hope I can someday get the favor of God? And it was a church family, but you felt like there was a door that was closed in your face. Perhaps that was the case. Perhaps it was someone who was a little overzealous from high school or college, got a little too preachy, and every time they came around, you find yourself looking for an exit, and it was a turnoff, and you felt like it actually closed the door in your face. Perhaps it was a church, they used the word grace, but it was just angry and demeaning and unkind and ungracious. Week after week after week after week, and it's like a door closed in your face. Perhaps it was a man or woman that you worked for that you considered to be like up there as far as a believer, a follower, maybe even a pastor, and then you found out they were a crook or living a double life, and a door closed on you. But if truth were told, if I ask the question, who closed the door? A lot of times, the most honest answer you can give is that you did. Many of you would go, dude, I closed the door and I walked. If there's only one image I want you to walk away with today, it's this image here, and it's just an image of an open door. It's an image of an open door. Jesus would say on Tuesday of his last week, you close the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, and I am here to open it, but you have to walk through. It's your job to walk through. Jesus, he came and lived and taught and died to open the door, to create an all-access pass to the presence of the Father. He came to open the door. You have to walk through it. And so we ask that our gracious God would mold us and shape us, soften us, and return to call us home one day at a time. We give thanks that we've been in each other's company to be able to explore this rich story, but also to absorb, to listen, and to hear the heartbeat of God when we find ourselves far, far away. We give thanks for this day, and we give thanks for Christ and what he came to do. We ask this in his name. Amen. Have a good week.